So yesterday was June 1st, and it was the kickoff of the 2021 hurricane season. And it's one of those interesting topics we have on a day to day. So we have those discussions around coastal cities when it comes to hurricane city and hurricane season. What do we do about it? We talk about flood insurance. So today's We Wonder is all about flood insurance. So I wanted to introduce Amy Marion. She's the flood senior manager at NatGen. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you, Chris?
I am doing very, very well. And it's an interesting topic for me, as you know, that I've experienced a hurricane just last year and experienced some flooding at my own house. So I am very familiar with the usage from a consumer perspective.
Well, interesting that you talk about that we just kicked off the flood season yesterday. However, we've already had a storm. So Anna has already came and gone. We are looking at a pretty active flood season or hurricane season per the different resources that are out there. We are seeing 13 to 20 hurricanes, up to 8 named hurricanes, which is a cat. And then I think 8, I'm sorry.
You're talking named storms, yeah. We got some
several named storms.
So yeah, we got some significant ones coming, at least expectations for it this year. And last year was, I wouldn't say quiet.
No. No, we actually had, so this year actually marks the 7th consecutive year that we've had storm activity prior to the beginning of storm season. And last year, the first storm that we had was a Tropical Storm Faye, and she actually caused over $400 million worth of damage in Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. So it's not just in Florida, it's not just in the South, it's also all the way up the Eastern Seaboard. And they seem to be moving further inland when they come.
Which is not good news, right?
No.
So that's why we're here today to talk a little bit about flood insurance, because it's important, and that's a great point, is, obviously lived in Colorado for a while, and there is definitely flood zones around major rivers there when we have, storms and melting coming off of, from seasonal snows. And then you have, monsoon kind of rains all of a sudden show up, you're going to get flooding in those areas. And you would not traditionally think that that's a flood area. But storms can hit anywhere, right? So Texas is always concerned, Louisiana is concerned, but Hawaii was hit the year before. So, again, these are not isolated instances. You really should be considering flood insurance. And I think there was a stat you gave me before, and we'll get to some of those more later, was, the majority of the folks, even in coastal towns, they don't have flood insurance.
I was looking at some statistics, and these are pulled from 2017, but I'm sure they're still relatively true. And there's in Florida alone, there's 4.4 million homes that are in a required flood zone. And 1.6 million of those homes do not carry flood. And then 92% of all the homes in Florida that are in an X zone also do not carry flood.
So what happens if your home gets flooded and you don't have flood insurance?
So there's a couple of things that you have to consider if you do not carry flood insurance. One is, some people say, well, I'll just wait for FEMA to come in and give FEMA relief. Well, if it isn't a named storm, if it isn't something that is considered a disaster by the governor or the president, there will be no FEMA relief. And I can give you documents that will show you the comparison between disaster relief and flood insurance. So that's one of the reasons why flood insurance is something to consider, because things like an example would be in Tampa, 2 different times there's been water main breaks. Those water main breaks happen to occur in zones that were considered an X zone, a low hazard zone. And those folks got flooded. And had they had flood insurance, they would have had coverage, but they did not, so they wouldn't. So these are just instances where, another good example is when Las Vegas got some torrential downpours. They're in the middle of the desert. It's hard ground. And when the rains came, it did not absorb and it flooded. And they are actually, the city of Las Vegas was one of the newest applicants to the National Flood Insurance Program.
Wow. See, that's something no one would ever think, right? And
Right.
I go out there, work trips all the time, and I can tell you several restaurants that I attended, they're off strip. We got flooded, and actually the whole roofs caved in and everything because they just had not seen that kind of rain in forever. So it was,
And they weren't even participating at the time, so now they are.
so it's always important, no matter where you live, to at least consider it if you're anywhere near. So let's talk a little bit about that, Amy. So I'm going to ask you right now. So what is flood insurance? It is not regular homeowners coverage. What exactly is flood insurance?
Flood insurance is the coverage that covers you for the peril of flood, and a definition of flood will vary slightly depending on whether you're using the National Flood Insurance Program or whether you're using a private flood program. A private flood program is going to have a broader definition, but ultimately it's rising water that comes from the ground up. And we've always, our layman example is, if the roof gets blown off and the rain comes down, that's a wind event. If the water rises up into your home, that's a flood event. So that's the difference between when coverage applies. And again, the definitions become a little broader when you get into the private flood program.
So that's great. So my next question obviously is why have it? Like, why have flood insurance? Because you're touching on a few of these points. Is it something where, hey, I just had my a pipe burst on the second floor of my home and it flooded down? Is that flood insurance or is that homeowners?
That would be homeowners. That's a water loss claim.
Okay.
So it's coming from the outside, rising up.
Got it. So it's really either seawater or river water or something, maybe even a sewer break like that, where the water physically rises. Got it.
Correct. Yes, in fact, in North Manatee County in Florida, there was recently an event where they had a retention system in place, and it was compromised. And they were working fast and furiously to fix this compromise, because had it broken loose, thousands upon thousands of homes would have flooded.
Well, and fortunately we got that in the national news, and I live near. It's great to get out there, but it does draw attention to different concerns, because that's not a hurricane event. That was just a natural, not a natural event, but a man-made event locally. They could have a significant problem for a lot of homes around there. So very important. So that's why you have it, right? You just never know. And I'm sure in certain areas, it's incredibly economical to have. In areas where it's not, you see the term 100-year flood may occur. We've had that term in Colorado a few times, except it happened, twice in 3 years. And I went, is that really 100-year? We got a lot more snow and rain this year. I don't know. So
right. Yeah, the terms 100-year and 500-year flood, I'm not sure who came up with that, because even in the 500-year floodplain, we're seeing 30% of all flood losses. So that just goes to show you that was just something, like, I think you and I talked about it. Somebody said, this flood hasn't happened like this in 100 years, but 3 years later, another one came and it was even bigger than the last. So
I don't think they were keeping really good records back then. Maybe that was the thing.
Possibly not.
We've seen this not only just like Louisiana, right? We've seen this, like, as you mentioned before, in Maryland, right? I remember seeing stuff in Ellicott City where they were flooding up all around that floodplain, and there's water running through the streets. I mean, it could happen literally anywhere. It could happen in Pittsburgh. It could happen in a lot of different areas. So definitely important to consider adding flood insurance to your existing policies. So you brought up the point earlier. There's a federal coverage, right? Mm-hmm. National coverage, and then there's private flood. So tell me a little bit about the difference between the two so everyone knows.
Okay. So from the perspective of a federal flood policy for a homeowner, you are maxed out at $250,000 for your building coverage. You are maxed out at $100,000 for your contents coverage. The only time you have replacement cost on your building coverage is if it is your primary residence that you live in 80% of the time and you're covered 80% to value or max limits of the program. Otherwise, if you have a secondary home, a vacation home, that type of thing, if you're a snowbird, that is actual cash value on your building. And it's always actual cash value on your contents. And you will have two deductibles, one on each line. There's no other structures coverage. There's no loss of use coverage. It's the bare minimum. It's what the government put out in 1968 when flood insurance companies were like, when a flood comes and it takes out an entire community versus if a fire happens, it's usually one house. But when a flood comes, it takes out an entire community, which becomes seriously detrimental to an insurance carrier. And there was no data back then. So there's data now. And so now what you have private flood carriers who are using different types of tech to go in and rate a risk, and you can get higher limits, replacement cost value, onwards to $1.5 million in building coverage at replacement cost. You have other structures coverage. You have loss of use coverage. We have options for you that have HO3 type coverage for the peril of flood. So it's making its turn, and we're using, the past data to turn it into a product that is sustainable and affordable.
I love it. So, you mentioned a few things, a lot of things in there that are very interesting. You told me a story the other day where, you had someone that said, I don't need it. I'm in an area, that really, I should be fine. And there was a flood came in, a high rising water, and it was a hurricane. It blew the house literally off foundation into another, structure across the street. That means that you're going to have to replace that home.
Correct.
So if you're talking about, just the bare minimum, that home's worth $1 million, not including the land, and you only have $250,000 to rebuild. So
Correct.
you got to come up with the other amount of money if you don't have the proper coverage.
That is absolutely correct. And that's something that truly did happen. Michael came in, and this is a very good example of, you don't have to be sitting on the Atlantic Ocean. You don't have to be sitting on the Gulf of Mexico. This person's home sat on the Gulf in Port St. Joe. And when that water came in, when that surge came in, it did push the house off of its foundation and into the condos across the street. It was a total loss. It was a $1 million+ home with $250,000 worth of coverage, and it was not but 6 months old.
Oh, it's painful.
It's very painful. And from a perspective from an agent's perspective, that could be an E&O claim because they didn't have adequate coverage.
Exactly. Well, quick question for you on that then. Let's say you're going through that process and you're buying a home in an area. Does the inspection that you've done from the home cover it, or do insurance companies send people out to do inspections to make sure you're adequately secure? I mean, even the home's relatively new and meet new construction codes. What if it's an older home and it's near the water and they want to check those things? Do they send people out as well?
We don't typically send people out for inspection. The only time you would necessarily do that if there's been some sort of change to the foundation type. Probably a good example was after Katrina. A lot of folks raised their house up, and we can actually capture a lot of that through photos, which is how we do most of our inspection, if you will.
Fantastic. Well, there you go. Well, that's good to know. Well, tell us a little bit about, National General. Let's tell a bit about NatGen resources, and you had some flood facts. So are these type of resources available for consumers, for the general public, or is this available just to agency owners and insurance funds?
We actually use the source called FloodSmart, which is put together by FEMA. Mm-hmm. And there is a portion of FloodSmart that is for the agent, and there is a portion of FloodSmart that is for the consumer. And agents can actually access FloodSmart and obtain consumer-facing information that helps them explain the need for flood. Mm-hmm. As far as our particular niche, we also offer you, when you do a quote, a report on the property that you're quoting that helps you also explain the need for flood. But the NFIP, or the National Flood Insurance Program, through floodsmart.gov does a great job with putting together information for the consumer as well as the agent.
That's great. So I would say that, I would imagine most folks that are in an area where it may even be a consideration, their insurance agent's going to tell them right off the bat, hey, you need to have this. The question I was going to have for you was, is it typically very expensive to have, homeowners is homeowners, right? But is it expensive to have flood insurance?
So I think that's a relative question, because when you're looking at the cost of a premium versus the cost of a loss, what is expensive?
Right.
You can get premiums depending on the state. Even in Florida, you can get them as low as $300. And they can go upwards to $20,000. But you have to consider what's at stake. Again, we talk about, even with the flood maps, the flood nerd in me always says, if you're looking and you're in an X zone, and if you have the ability to see how far you are from a required zone, I always say Mother Nature didn't sign off on the maps that the Army Corps of Engineers put out there. So she doesn't know where those lines are, and when the rain comes, it's not stopping.
Right.
So to your point, it's relative to the value of a loss.
Exactly. So, and I would imagine if you have any type of a mortgage on there, they're going to require that you have that coverage anyway. So
yes, if you are in an A or B zone, a lender is going to require coverage. They will only require you to carry the minimum or the maximum $250 offered by the program. And most of the private flood products out there these days are lender compliant in that they are equal to or greater than the coverage offered by the NFIP.
Mm-hmm.
So you do have that option as well. We always suggest to cover the house at full coverage, of course, in the event of a total loss.
Yeah, well, I would imagine, especially as our agents are on the line, some of these are watching these videos, they're going to recommend that you have full coverage anyway, and make sure everyone's adequately covered. But the good news with We Insure is the fact that they have a lot of options out there. If one area is not available for one carrier, we have other carriers. But I don't think you guys are limiting any area, at least in the state of Florida and most of the country. But just in the state of Florida specifically, I don't think you limit any counties or any areas. Is that correct?
That is correct. We are open in all counties in Florida. And in any state we're open in, we have no closed zip codes. Now, to say that we won't rate for the risk, we will. And that's how we become sustainable. And that's what we have said all along. We want to be the resolution, and we don't want you to have to quote it again next year. So,
yeah. Fair enough. No, and I think that's great. And that's good news for everyone to hear, because you hear a lot of times just in general, hey, there's no carriers anywhere. There's no carriers anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make sure that was a point that we mentioned. You guys are writing on the flood side, writing, any zip code is open. As you mentioned, the price points will change based on the risk, but you'd expect that, right?
Right. And you're going to see more of that actually with FEMA. I mean, FEMA has since 1968, they have rated based on a zone. BCXAV. That's what it's been. They in October are getting ready to change that to what they call risk rating 2.0. They'll use geocoding just like a lot of the private flood carriers are doing now to rate the risk. So it will be more actuarially responsible in their rates, and we'll see how that turns out. But something to keep an eye open for.
Well, I can tell you as a consumer, I'm always glad to hear that there's options to, any kind of a federal and national policy, because I want to have, the full coverage, the best coverage I can afford, and still cover my house, fully. But
Right.
There's other resources out there. And again, in addition to what you mentioned before, if you check your own community, I know that in different communities around the state or any other coastal towns, they may send you some resource guides in your own community that'll say, here's how to mitigate, for flooding, here's how to mitigate those risks. Here's what to look for. I know that in areas around here, they'll bring in big piles of sand and give you sandbags and, start preparing early if there is an imminent storm, at least potentially an imminent storm. A lot of those storms are unpredictable because they shift at the last minute.
Right.
But ultimately, it's better to be better safe than sorry in most of those cases. So, well.
And every community has a floodplain manager, and it doesn't hurt to reach out to your floodplain manager. It keeps you in the loop on what's going on in your community. Florida in particular has been the hub of, most all flood policies are in Florida, and that's interesting considering the stats I gave you earlier. But map changes happen. I know I worked with a couple of WE agents on the southwest side of the state regarding map changes that were going on there. You have map changes going on in South Florida, in the Broward County area. So just, your floodplain manager is always a very good resource, and they'll keep you in tune with what's going on in your community as far as meetings regarding the changes of flood maps. And we try to do our best to keep you up to date with that as well.
Well, this has been very, very, very helpful because I think the resource, just having this kind of discussion, whether you are, especially in a hot real estate market, whether you're a realtor and having discussions with clients moving in or out of flood zones. And like I said, this could happen in Colorado or Hawaii or, Maryland or New York, right? So keeping track of this is probably wise as an agent as you're having those discussions. And of course, consulting with your own WeInsure agent would be wise just to get that next level of detail and forwarding it on for your clients to really make sure they're covered. So,
Correct.
Amy, I have to tell you, I like the term flood nerd, but I do appreciate you joining us today and giving us the insight. And again, these resources and having these discussions are invaluable, I'm sure, for a lot of folks. So I really appreciate it and have a great day.
You do the same. Thank you, Chris.
You got it.